You're watching the Brotherhoodofgaming.com, and this is the Tales of Retrospective. Be sure to go back and check episode 0 if you haven't done so already. But right now, this is episode 1, part 1 of Tales of Phantasia, the history of. Now, Tales of Phantasia was officially released on December 15th, 1995. But the history lesson isn't exactly going to begin here, because years prior, the Tales series has undergone some interesting developments that have been kind of vague, but has left just a little bit of information for us to shed some light upon.
So sit back and get comfy, because this episode of T.B.O.G's Tales of Retrospective will make you a fan of the series.
Because once we're done here, you're going to feel like a freaking nerd of this entire franchise. Tales of Phantasia's Retrospective, as well as the rest of the series, starts here.
So let's start way in the beginning to about the year 1987, back when He-Man was considered straight. A young video game programmer named Yoshiharu Gotanda began writing a manuscript story that was planned to be published as a fantasy novel called Tale Phantasia. Alongside the project, artist Yoshihiko Inigeki worked with Gotanda to create story images to go akin to the story he was telling. At the time, Yoshiharu was the small programmer in a video game development company by the name of Wolf Team. From the late 80s to early 90s, Wolf Team had already suffered some hardships, having been constantly going from an independent company to a reintegrated one to an absorbed company with Telenet. By which time, most of its original developers had been fed up and left altogether, including its original leader, Masahiro Akashino. Those who stayed behind were the team's new heads, which made Yoshiharu the lead programmer, accompanied by his companions, designer Masaki Norimoto, director Joe Asanuma, his graphics artist Yoshihiko Inigeki, and the up-and-coming music composer Motio Sakuraba. Which is probably the only name Tales fans will recognize.
From this point on, Wolf Team had actually been developing games for both the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo.
Such games as Soul Feast and Hyoden, Legend of the Scarlet King.
We could be in for a battle with the Star Garrison at 5 locations on our way to Earth. Be on the lookout when we're near Sirius, the weapons plant on the outer rim of Sirius, the artificial sun, the Pluto base and Jupiter.
Unfortunately, due to the poor reputation of Telenet and probably a few other reasons, the sales were far below expectations and the companies were in dire trouble. Fortunately though, Yoshiharu had an ace up his sleeve.
You guys don't even know why that's funny yet. He proposed to take the Tale Phantasia manuscript, which was still unpublished, and use it as the basis for their new game. The only problem was lack of funds. Since their sales were poor, they were already in the red, so the company outsourced and looked for outside help. With a high reputation and a knack for storytelling, Yoshiharu first went to try out working with Enix, whom by this time was a very strong developing company and having created a ton of games. Such classics as ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, Evo, and of course, Dragon Quest.
Now clearly, Enix would have been a great choice since they were all about storytelling. They more than likely would have understood Yoshiharu's passion and shared it with him.
But Telenet intervened and said, hey, we got you a producer.
In which Yoshiharu responded, wait, what? Who?
Namco Studios.
The Pac-Man arcade guys?
Oh yeah.
Now guys, understand, by today's standards, Namco is pretty badass, owning a ton of popular franchises like Tekken, Soul Calibur, and so on. But go back then, these guys were all about quick, actiony, quarter-eating arcade games. Very little effort was made into telling an actual story that went beyond the simple concept of they meet. From this point of view, working with Namco was going to be harder than Kevin Smith trying to make John Peters understand Superman. Not much time passes, and Tale Phantasia was greenlit to begin development.
Sad to say, it wasn't smooth sailing from there.
There were constant drawbacks on perspectives on how the story should look, feel, and how the story alone should progress.
Every worst case scenario possible set back the project the whole year.
But what could these problems actually be? They had the funding, sure. But let's gather some of the background details. After joining forces with Namco, some of their developers had to work with what was left of Wolf Team to make the big project come to fruition. And there is where the first big problem came into play. Yoshiharu definitely knew the story he wanted to tell, but hardware limitations sadly put a damper on his manuscript. What was originally a 3-arc story covering various histories of the world of Phantasia the entire first and second arc ended up being cut, and some of what was left over was an abridged adaptation. The third arc was the main story in which the game centered. However, even this had some alterations. Not much remains today to explain the story fully that once was, except some minor details about Douse's arrival from Darris Carlon to Asalia, a female main character named Winona Pickford who befriended him because she sympathized with his goals at the time. But as time passed, she saw that he was getting increasingly violent-natured. She then eventually started the original team to take him down, which is shown at the start of the game. The second story arc tells the story of Rhea Scarlet, a girl from a small town with parents who were researching magical technology. Dowse kills them for it. Sadly, her story arc was cut a little short and has very little involvement in the final product. Aside from these tales being cut, Winona Pickford's story does actually get a better detailed story in a novel form called Tales of Phantasia Katerurizaru Rikishi, which does serve as a prequel to the game. Unfortunately, there isn't a translation I could find, so good luck beyond that. But I need to address some more of the changes that had been done over the course of the partnership. While both parties understood that the current technology would only allow so much in-depth storytelling, some sacrifices had to be made, as sort of a give and take. Inageki, who had thus far been designing the characters you would play as, such as the main cast of the third story arc, ended up being quite different from what we know today.
I had suspicions long ago that the art design was one of the main drawbacks that set the project back, and I kinda hit the nail on the head because it turns out I was right.
Inageki's original concepts were a little bit different than the final product, and it shows.
His original character designs were still inputted into the game as the sprites for the gameplay, but they had completely different names from what we know today, such as Masakini, the sword fighter, Bowman, Temple, and Merlin.
They're not as colorful as we know them today, but Namco wanted their bright colors and they were gonna get them, damn it.
Sadly, their team cooperation wouldn't last. Namco had far too many ideas and didn't really share the vision of the original team, including the name of the game itself. While it was originally going to be called Tale Fantasia, for some odd reason they thought it would be better titled as Tales of Fantasia. This, among many other disagreements, caused Namco concern, so not long before the game was completed, Namco officially claimed all rights to the project and discontinued Wolf Team's involvement. Motio Sakuraba would stay as the composer and would do so for the remainder of the franchise. However, Yoshiaki Inageki, who designed the sprites and original characters, would be replaced with Kosuke Fujishima, who would redesign the characters and give them all new familiar names. Regardless of some of these character updates being coded into the game, it would have taken too much time to redraw every single in-game sprite with new images, so they remained the same.
It's unclear how Yoshihara feels about the disbandment of his team or the fact that Tale Fantasia was taken from him, and he probably won't have any comment to say on the grounds that he may want to avoid a lawsuit or slander.
Assuming that he's jaded at all.
But don't feel too bad for him. He still had one more ace up his sleeve, and with some of the others who left Wolf Team, used it to form the company today known as Tri-Ace. As its head programmer and owner, he's responsible for the video game series known as Star Ocean, which bears a familiar gameplay style relative to his original creation. With all that having taken place, the final due date was coming to a close, so Namco, with their newly revisioned team, had to quickly patch up the story and tell it to the best of their ability, as well as finish programming their newly formed linear motion battle system, which would become a staple of theirs. Wanting to push the console to its limits, the game was completed, and the date finally arrived. So, how did it fare? Tales of Phantasia's reception was very strong, although not at first. The game was actually stalled in sales due to Enix's release of their newest Dragon Quest game at the time. But it didn't take long for Tales of Phantasia to catch on. Once people started getting their hands on it, for most, it easily stole their hearts and became a hit. While it didn't exactly steal all the crowds of already established and popular RPGs that had status, what Tales of Phantasia did was grab people's attention. It was new, it was different, it told a compelling story that not many RPGs told before, but were starting to do at the time. But more interestingly, it was the only RPG that didn't follow the common formula. From the start of RPG gaming, gameplay was very limited. Though the story compelled a player to continue to the end, and the battles did demand a lot more strategy than some were willing to dish out, it was common not being able to avoid an oncoming attack you knew was coming. Tales of Phantasia did something different. Instead of standing still against your wishes, hoping to God the next enemy attack didn't flat out murder you, Namco's linear motion battle system allowed the game to go from random battle encounters to an almost side-scrolling fighter. No, not an exact fighter, but a similar premise. I'll explain. As soon as a random battle occurs in the middle of gameplay, the screen transitions over to a familiar 2D style fighter with chibi funny looking characters. The shoulder buttons allow your team to walk left or right, or you can control yourself using the D-pad. Pressing B did a character's basic attack. Depending on the distance would usually depict what kind of attack, from a simple slash to jumping high in the air. It's not perfect though. Granted, it's the first in the series, sure, it's not too well developed yet. But it was a start. Some of these basic attacks would at times leave you open for return fire, and the game usually decided if you were going to be lucky enough to defend. Though you were in control, it still felt like a game of chance sometimes. You always needed to be on your toes. After a series of fights, you would gain experience like in any kind of good old RPG. The experience would of course increase you and your party's statistics, allowing you to dish out more damage and endure more as well. Well, you get the idea. But you would also gain some special attacks, which you could assign to the A button. These are called arts. Now this is where the real fun came into play. Pulling off these moves made you feel badass, and are hella fun to do. The anticipation also boosts because the more you use each art, the potential you have to gain more special arts and experience. Let me tell you, nothing is more satisfying after kicking ass and seeing that new skill has been unlocked. Over the course of the series, this formula pretty much stayed consistent with little tweaks here and there to make it original and to improve where mistakes have been made. And I think most people will agree that no Tales game is exactly the same. The way you manipulate the arts in Tales of Phantasia is the only one that's very original, and it hasn't been used since, and for good reason. It took me a long time to figure this out, and even now it's pretty bizarre. In the skill settings, you have two sections, SR and LR, which stands for short range and long range. Only specific arts will be available for each section. Scion Bolt, or Demon Fang, or hell, even Sonic Blade, whatever you want to call it, are treated as long range attacks. Having a different attack share the long range section is why this system quickly became dated. There is no way to predict which of the arts the game is going to use. I've tried numerous times, but the only way to ensure that the attack you want is done is to have it and it alone be in the right section. Otherwise, it's like playing in the lottery. It's never clear exactly how far you have to be away from the enemy for it to be a long-ranged attack, but the short range is pretty clear. Be up in their face. But the same problem will happen there. Two different skills per section will leave you clueless. For the most part, it won't matter as long as it gets the job done, and you can withstand the backlash. The Y button serves as changing targets, but there are cases where mistakes can get you killed. Fortunately, there's ways around that. In or out of battle, you can bring up the status menu with the X button. Here, you can adjust a few things. You can change your party strategy by having teammates assigned to specific roles, change formation for battle tactics, or use items in the heat of battle like recovery gels, life potions, ailment fixes, and even food. You can and will gain a lot of these items from defeating enemies, bosses, treasure chests, talking to strangers, and of course, shopping.
Currency in this universe is called gold. Don't you just love how pretty much every company has their own name for it? Whether it be
Monies,
Zenny,
Gil,
Gold,
Gold,
Red Orbs.
Also, you can equip valuables to yourself and allies from armor, shields, better swords, and trinkets to aid in casting spells and or running faster. Like any other RPG, you naturally get to traverse a world map, find dungeons, towns, cities, and other exotic areas. Rarely out of order, but each place has a story to tell and awaits the right time for you to find it.
With Tales of Phantasia earning new Namco status in the community of role-playing games, it has opened up a whole new world.
And it was no doubt they wanted to keep this up, so during the progression of the franchise they planned on expanding, Wolf Team developers over time were restaffed and let go with Telenet still being involved. Motio Sakuraba stayed with them as more of a freelance basis. And all of them would work together to make further installments, until the year 2003 when Wolf Team finally dissolved and was transformed into the Tales Studio. And a few years later in 2007, Telenet sadly filed for bankruptcy, finally putting an end to what was left of the original Wolf Team. Namco had retained all ownership since then.
But a lot happened before then. Along the following years, new Tales games would be made, telling other stories.
This would, however, not be the last thing Tales of Phantasia had to say. Over the course of its years, Namco had made numerous efforts to go back and expand upon its storyline. During the highlight of the PlayStation era, they had gone and made 3 Mothership titles, along with an escort title or 2.
But one of the Mothership titles was a remake. December 23rd, 1998, updating and retelling the 1995 story of Tales of Phantasia with better visuals, redrawn and reanimated sprites to suit the new look they had wanted to give them, as well as new and more features like skits, which at any time during the game you could press the select button and watch your party members engage in conversation, connecting you even further to the characters and the story. Another feature was the new upgraded enhanced linear motion battle system. While the delays and pauses from spells remained, the real upgrade was to the skill setting. No longer were you limited by long range or short range. Instead, now you could set any skill you wanted to a corresponding arrow key in unison with the arc button. This overall made battle flow much more smoothly, and to this day it's a staple for most of the franchise. This version also included a new optional playable character, Suzu Fujibayashi, who did appear in the first game, but not as a partner.
While bits and pieces were tweaked in the PlayStation version, players would be surprised by a third form of the final boss.
Originally, the game only had 2 final boss forms, but probably the greatest feature added onto the game was the 4-way multiplayer.
Each person would control a single character in battle, completed with their own skills and powers, making working together as a team incredibly fun, which was a first for RPGs.
Getting it to work, however, was kind of a weird mechanical experiment. You would think plugging in multiple controllers in their port sockets would be enough to get the characters rolling. Sadly, that's not really the case.
You see, this idea was first introduced in Tales of Destiny, the second game in Tales history.
Yeah, but that's a story for another day. The idea being that there's a small item called a channeling, which sends electrical signals through the port socket.
By equipping the channeling to the character you want a party member to play as well as have them set in the right order, only then can party members be playable. It's a pretty ambitious mechanic. The only downside is that it takes up an available item slot which could have been used for something useful, and you can accidentally sell them, in which case you're out of luck. It wasn't until the third installment that the idea was abolished. Another plus was even player 1 didn't always have to play as Kless anymore. An altered ending, a new anime opening theme, high-quality reorchestrated soundtrack, an encounter rate that allows you to take more than 2 steps, more side quests, more powers. I could go on for hours.
Of all of the remakes, Tales of Phantasia for the PlayStation is actually my favorite of the bunch. Unfortunately though, like the first one, neither of these ever got ported to America.
Until...
I dwell amidst the abounding light of heaven. Thou art at the gate to the underworld. Come forth, thunder of the gods. What the heck is that? It ends here. Indignation!
Tales of Phantasia was remade for the Game Boy Advance. Although originally released on August 1st, 2003 in Japan, this was when America finally got to see the story officially. Because of its appearance on a moderately limited piece of technology, certainly the GBA, though a great handheld, had very clear limits of what it could do. Certainly not what we knew Phantasia was capable of. So what Namco did was take elements from both the original Super Famicom title and some of what made the PlayStation version great, and try to mix and match them for a salvageable port. The sprites were used from the PlayStation, while backgrounds were taken from the Super Nintendo. The translation was an oxymoron in itself, as certain words and phrases were changed from what most people knew, such as Ragnarok turning into kangaroo. Some people found confusion out of Kless being turned into Cress as well. The original music was rearranged into GBA standard, which was all it could handle really. The graphics had a saturation buffer to make the colors further vibrant. It also included voice acting, which I found to be hilarious, however, most thought of it as an absolute joke.
Right in peace.
And the Game Boy Advance version of this game was technically a mixed bag. While most were happy to finally be able to play it, period, it couldn't be denied it was genuinely weaker, and to this day, it remains as one of the most disliked adaptations.
However, unfortunately, it would also be the only Tales of Phantasia game America would see for a long time.
That same year, there's another remake being made for the PSP. That's Tales of Fantasia, the full voice edition.
The name itself kinda speaks aloud that the majority of this particular title was revoiced most of the entire game, including major plot points and other things, but this version also once again tweaked the aspect of the game. You now had a bit of a wider angle, being able to see more around you as well as traveling the overworld. Even further, a grade system was added to it, which is another key feature most of the recent Tales games have. Long story short, a grade system is what you will see upon completion of the game. With grade points you earn during your adventure, you can purchase special benefits if you decide to play again. One last feature is the sprites were once again updated. They no longer had that over-the-top chibi cute look, but had more of a mature appearance later games were using at the time. Namco still wasn't finished, because included in their new Tales title was a bonus remake of Tales of Phantasia, also for the PSP. This one to date serves as being the popular one because it included all of the greatest aspects of what made them great, and made it faster, and the magic spells that always made the game pause in order to cast them were removed. Now all of the spells and powers were capable of being activated in real time. It was faster, smoother, and a great bonus to an already great edition, and was well received. But there was one last matter.
Namco made numerous efforts to make sure that there was not a single piece of technology that you didn't own that wasn't capable of playing Tales of Phantasia in some way, shape, or form. So the Game Boy Advance version, which was released so many years ago, actually got ported to Japanese cell phones later in its years. But later on, in 2013, an iOS version was actually recreated just as well. And after many years...
Tales of Phantasia finally saw America once again, with our own iOS remake of the game. But I'm reluctant to say that it serves as being one of the most butchered ports ever received. The app was free to play, but the problem that lay within it were far too big to ignore. First off, it was a strange idea that people had to adapt to using the touchscreen to literally do everything. If only that was the only flaw. Controlling movement in the open world is terrible. You can move your fingers along the screen like a virtual joystick, but Kless on screen reacts way too violently, and way too fast that controlling is a nightmare. You can also tap the screen where you want him to go, and he will, like a bolt of lightning, travel there if able. This version sadly features the infamous Always Online mode, by having many of the in-game save points removed. The player is forced to have a constant connection while waiting through connection issues to save or even access the game at times. Without a connection, you aren't saving your progress. Some features were also deliberately removed from the game, such as the grade shop and the ability to adjust the game's difficulty setting. This game has been adjusted to be a very difficult one, which sometimes ranges from hard to very hard at certain intervals. Why do this, you may ask? Well, here was the sneaky plan. The game was indeed free to play, and you weren't demanded to use this feature. However, from the start of the game, you are introduced to a new item called a Miracle Orb. What it does is after your inevitable defeat in combat, you will be given the option to be revived once with a status boost. This new feature is being able to go to Namco's purchase shop and use real money to purchase more of these Miracle Orbs and experience jumps that you will no doubt want to use because of their forced difficulty setting. It's treated as a scam to make the game feel as miserable as possible, making you want to cave in or just give up. The game will often remind you that you are able to purchase these things as well. I mentioned that saving without a connection was nigh impossible, but to increase the tension, some critical area save zones were also deleted for that factor as well. But how do you fight at all in this game? Well, here's how.
While in battle, pressing certain areas of the screen will have Kless do different attacks. Using arts is now simplified to dragging your finger in the direction in which you set your skills.
No games company is perfect. All of them have made mistakes and poor business choices time and time again, but they can also do a lot of good too, so I made no effort to hold Namco's feet to the fire for this flop. After all, it was free. Being the second version to be released outside of Japan, it's kind of disheartening to say that we have the two worst adaptations of Tales of Phantasia. But that didn't stop the fans. Across the globe, fans of the series have come together in groups to make efforts to create translation patches for various incarnations. The Super Famicom version has been English patched by a group called Day-Jap Translations, and has even been turned into an actual vintage Super Nintendo cartridge available for purchase. Another group called Absolute Zero Translations has been able to patch the original PlayStation game, which most have been able to play via emulation. There was also a third group called Fantasian Productions that have, well, attempted for 10 years to create a translation of their own.
Damn! The thing to take from all of this is that the fans of this Tales franchise have been inspired and touched by it in numerous ways. So what good company wouldn't want to adhere to that with some good old-fashioned
Fan service!
Over the years, Namco had released some mangas, toys, and even a 4-part anime DVD which is the length of a feature film. In 2007, America got an official release of the Tales of Phantasia movie, and while it's great fan service that Tales loyalists will enjoy, even they point out that fitting a story that massive into a 4-part anime was asking a lot. So, liberties were taken. The story was gradually shortened, key plot points were removed, and events were retold to better make sense to the quick summary of the show. Hey, it was still a lot of fun to watch, and it was a great show in itself.
Whew, that is a ton of history.
Now you understand the whole entire history and making of Tales of Phantasia. Unless you already played the game, you might be wondering,
What exactly is the storyline to Tales of Phantasia? Well, be sure to join us next time in the Tales of Retrospective Episode 1, Part 2, The Tale Begins, where we will discuss the entire storyline for you. By the way, massive spoilers. Meanwhile, I'm William Morris, he's Nathaniel Reyes, and you have been watching the BrotherhoodofGaming.com.
keep on gaming, viewers.
Until next time.